So I do my best to hang out with people who don't go to our church. Like whenever I get an invite from an individual or a group of people who I'm not sure if they're a Christian or where they stand with Christ, I almost always accept their offer to get together. You know, as a pastor, I spend a lot of time with believers, and so I need to make that extra effort in order to make sure that I get out, you know, amongst people in the world, right? The real world. Sometimes people will, invite me for a cup of coffee. Sometimes we get chicken wings and beer. Other times it's a cigar lounge. I don't know. We go many different places, and we talk about everything. One of the things I love to tell people is I actually enjoy talking about the things that you're not supposed to talk about. Like politics and religion. They're like my favorite things to discuss. Sometimes I find that people agree with me on my views, both. Other times I find that they agree with some, but not all. And sometimes, like this past week, I find people who disagree with me on just about everything. The person actually this last week was overhearing a conversation that I was having with a guy that invited me out to hang out. I met him for the Young Republicans group, and we were talking about all of the Supreme Court decisions as of late, and we're just celebrating and talking through those. Like, man, isn't this great? Even just since last year, the overturning of Roe v. Wade, and then now, these past few decisions, and the person overhearing our conversation considered my views, and she said so, as bigoted, outdated, and viewed Christians, and specifically Christianity, as the reason for all of the problems in our society today. So, again, these are the things I love talking about. After about an hour of heated debate, and then also some good laughs, and good discussion back and forth, not only was it found out that I was a Republican, but also that I was a Christian. And before I left, I told her that I was a pastor, and I invited her to church this morning. Ah, darn it. Not here. Okay. Wasn't that convincing, I suppose. But pray for her. I do think that I was the first Bible-believing Christian that she ever really shared her views with. So today, this morning, we're going to see a debate in our text. Hold your ears. All right. Something in the throat. Wow. Yeah. Is that what it is? You think so? Canada. Blame Canada, right? I mean, no. Yeah. Oh, yeah. Go figure. Colin's not here. Yeah, okay. It was definitely him. Oh, gosh. Today we see a debate in our text, a debate and a controversy over the Sabbath law and what it means to obey this law or to break this law, and what is the purpose of the law? Why was the law even given in the first place? So if you turn your Bibles, if you have them with you, to Matthew 12, 1 through 14 is where we'll be. As we near kind of this halfway point in the Gospel of Matthew, we find a real pivotal text. Jesus gave his hungry disciples permission to break the Sabbath, or at least so the Pharisees thought. And the Pharisees caught wind of what they were doing, and they were going to refuse to let that slide. They rebuked Jesus, and they condemned his followers. Jesus, I know, right? It's thick. Jesus, in turn, rebuked and corrected them and proceeded to break their Sabbath laws even right in front of the Pharisees' faces. The Pharisees had enough, and from this point forward in the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees are going to plot with one another on how they might destroy Jesus. This passage is full of passion, of irony, of power and authority and controversy over the interpretation of the Sabbath law. So Matthew 12, 1 and 2 says, "At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath," likely on his way to the synagogue, on the way to church, if you will, right? To go worship the Lord. At that time, Jesus went through the grain fields on the Sabbath, and his disciples were hungry. And they began to pluck heads of grain and eat them. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, "Look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath." Now the Pharisees had an issue, but the issue was not with the disciples grazing the fields. You're allowed to do that. Deuteronomy 23:25 says, if you go into your neighbor's standing grain, in other words, it's not been harvested, not been knocked down, this is still standing grain, you may pluck the ears with your hand, but you may not put a sickle to your neighbor's standing grain. So it's okay, right, to go through even your neighbor's fields and take a little bit of grain and just to eat it. And that's okay. That would not be considered, stealing. This is a permissible thing, right? Some of you with some real big appetites are like, man, I think I could, eat every day on my neighbor's grain, or, maybe I'll go through his berry patch next. I don't know, right? So, but nonetheless, this is permissible. This is okay. But you can't take a sickle to it. You can't actually harvest and take it home with you. So it's permissible. The Pharisees did not have an issue in what they were doing, but when they did it. When the Pharisees saw it, they said to him, look, your disciples are doing what is not lawful to do on the Sabbath. They're thinking of Exodus 20, verse 10, when God said that on the seventh day, a Sabbath is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. So the Sabbath day is a day of worship to the Lord your God, and on it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter. And it can't just be your family that rests and then you let the servants, do all the work for you. No, even your male servant or your female servant, you can't even let your livestock do work, or your livestock, or even a sojourner from out of town, if they come in, who's within your gates, they need to rest too. They are to do no work. The day is for worship. Exodus 34:21 says, 6 days you shall work, but on the seventh day you shall rest. 6 days to do your work, and on that seventh day, rest. I like this, even in plowing time and in harvest time. So even when you could really use that extra day for plowing, you need to rest. You and your servants and even your livestock, everyone needs to rest. Even in harvest time, we could really use that one extra day. Yes, even in harvest time. Don't take that extra day to work. That day is a day of rest unto the Lord, a day of worship. So you can't take that extra day to get ahead. You must rest and worship the Lord. Now with the general command to rest and not work on the Sabbath, the Pharisees and other rabbis gave their interpretation as to what was considered work. What do you mean by do not work? How much not work can I do on a Sabbath? Now they considered the disciples plucking the ears as harvesting, which, certainly this is not harvesting. They're just taking a few grains and eating on their way to the synagogue. But they're considering even just the plucking of these ears of wheat to be harvesting, and then even as they separate the wheat from the chaff, they're considering that to be threshing, as an actual harvesting and threshing of the wheat. So they are very particular as to what they believe working is on the Sabbath. However, Jesus is going to challenge their interpretation of the Sabbath and even ask them if they've not read the rest of the scriptures past Exodus. He said to them in verse 3, have you not read what David did when he was hungry? And those who were with him? How he entered the house of God and ate the bread of the presence, which was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those who were with him, but only for the priests. Only for the priests to eat. Now Jesus is referring to the occasion when David's men were hungry, and they went into the temple and they asked the priest for the leftover bread. The priest would change out the bread every day. It was there as a reminder of the fresh manna that God provided from heaven to his people who were in the wilderness. So he called for inside the tabernacle, right, and then inside the temple, which is just the permanent structure of the mobile version, right? As you would go in, you would always see fresh bread. And it's supposed to remind you of those days that God provided manna from heaven. So the tabernacle and the temple always smelled of freshly baked bread. And the next day, the priests would be permitted, right, to eat the day-old bread as they would put out the fresh. So you put out the fresh, you take away the old, and the priests were allowed to eat, but only the priest. However, David's men were starving. He and his men were hungry. They had nothing to eat. So David thought, well, we should go to the temple and ask for that day-old bread. They were starving. Now, what should the priest do? In this moment when the anointed king, David, is starving and is in need of food, he and his men, what should the priest do in this moment? Jesus says he does the right thing. You feed the king and his men. That's what you do. Have you not read what David did? Now consider the similarities here even. Jesus is the greater David. He's got hungry men with him. Hungry followers. He's anointed king as well, right? This is my son in whom I'm well pleased. But not yet upon his throne. He's on the move. He's facing opposition from the current king and rulers of Israel, King Saul, King Herod. Yet David and the son of David both had a few loyal followers. Both groups of those loyal men became hungry, and it was permitted for the anointed King David to have the leftover bread for he and his men. And King Jesus, who is the everlasting King, the anointed Messiah, who shall sit on the throne of David forever, is not only king, but he's also high priest after the order of Melchizedek, and would have every right to eat of the day-old bread. And, he's God in the flesh. He could do whatever he wanted. But nonetheless, he has not come to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. And he says, have you not read? Thus it is lawful for both David's men to eat in this situation, and also for his disciples to eat the grain. And he goes on, because they are confused as to even the purpose behind the giving of the law of the Sabbath. He says, or have you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guiltless? Right? Because they're changing out the bread. They are working on the Sabbath. They are doing work, and they are eating of the bread and doing all of their priestly duties. He says, but I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. I love this. He says that these priests, even while they are working, are guiltless, even though they're inside the temple, near to the presence of God. The only thing separating them would be the veil. And these priests are doing work on the Sabbath, but they're guiltless. They're guiltless against sinning against the Sabbath because they are temple priests. And then Jesus says, and I tell you, something greater than the temple is here. Jesus is referring to himself. Not only is Jesus the greater David, the greater king, Jesus is also the greater temple. Jesus is God in the flesh. John 1:14 says that the Word became flesh and dwelt, or the Word would be tabernacled among us. He tabernacled among us. In what way? Well, in the same way that God was in the tabernacle behind the veil, and even in the temple behind the veil. Jesus is this mobile version of the temple. He's a tabernacle, veiled in what? Flesh. God is with them. He's with his people, and his people can now see him and behold him and follow him. The purpose of the temple was always so that God could dwell with his people. The sacrificial system was also so that a holy God could dwell with a sinful people and not annihilate all of them, but instead be with them. The purpose of the Sabbath was for man to be refreshed as they worshiped the Lord. So the disciples were hungry and they needed to eat, and God fed them in accordance with the law. Just like he fed his followers in the wilderness when they were hungry. This is God in the flesh. His disciples did not disobey or dishonor God. They obeyed God in the flesh. They obeyed his law. They were in need, and like David's men, they did nothing wrong. Like priests working in the temple, the disciples are doing the work of the Lord with the Lord himself. And they are guiltless for eating the grain. Now the Pharisees, what are they doing? Man, they are, Jesus will say this later in Matthew 23. He says the Pharisees are straining out a gnat and yet swallowing a camel, right? Straining out a gnat because they didn't want to accidentally eat an insect that would be unclean, so they would, filter their water before they would drink it, even to strain out the gnat because they didn't want to disobey God's law. And yet they miss the greater and more weightier things of the law. They miss the spirit of the law. They miss the character and nature of God within the law. They're focused on these smallest matters and details, and yet ignoring the greater commandments of loving God and their neighbor. He says in verse 7, if you had known what this means, I desire mercy and not sacrifice, you would not have condemned the guiltless. It says the law is not simply a list of arbitrary ordinances and commands. No, see, the law of God expresses the character and the very nature of God. He said, if you knew what this means, if you knew what it means, or what I desire, what my goals are, what I most is, I desire mercy. My main goal is not, the sacrifice itself. It's so that I can show you forgiveness. It's so that I can be merciful to you. The end goal is not the sacrifice itself. The end goal is to be able to show mercy to my people. God desires mercy and not sacrifice. The reason for the sacrificial system was to show mercy. The reason for the sacrifice was to bring God and man together, not to keep them apart. Likewise, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath is supposed to bring rest and refreshment, to rest from working and to feast and fellowship and worship God. Yet they have made the Sabbath exhausting. The Pharisees have made the Sabbath exhausting to try to follow. They're more concerned about the not working part than the worshiping God part and the good that it does for man. They've made the Sabbath itself a great burden to carry. Jesus says, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Jesus is not teaching that it's okay to break the Sabbath law and just do whatever you want and work that extra day and get it done and don't, forget about church. You can do that next week, right? No. He's not saying it's just okay to break the Sabbath. Jesus is rebuking the Pharisees and correcting their view of the Sabbath law. He says you clearly do not understand the purpose and meaning of the Sabbath. If you did, you would know that it is not only permissible to do good on the Sabbath, it's inherent in the command itself. So Jesus is the one who's going to school them on the meaning of the Sabbath, as he is already doing. For the Son of Man, verse 8, is Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus is the greater David. Jesus is the greater temple, the very presence of God. And Jesus is the Lord of the Sabbath. Yes, he says the Son of Man. He's referring to Daniel chapter 7. In Daniel 7, the Ancient of Days that gives the Son of Man authority over all things. So, Jesus, with the authority from God the Father, is Lord, Master, Ruler, final authority, and he's even the one who gave the command to Moses in the first place. So what happens next is going to be an object lesson. The class is in session. Jesus and his disciples make it to the synagogue, Matthew 12, 9 through 10. He went on from there and he entered their synagogue, and a man was there in the synagogue with a withered hand. And they asked him, that is, the Pharisees asked Jesus, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? They already knew what their answer was. They asked Jesus this question so that they might accuse him and catch him and show him worthy of death for breaking the Sabbath. But the Lord of the Sabbath will ask the questions here. Verse 11 through 12, he said to them, Jesus says to the Pharisees, which one of you who has a sheep, if it falls into a pit on the Sabbath, will not take hold of it and lift it out? He says, of how much more value is a man than a sheep? So it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. The Sabbath is good for man. The Sabbath is also good for beast. Even animals did no work on the Sabbath. They were allowed to rest. The people, the animals, the fields, everything rested. The Sabbath was peace for all. Now, even on a good and restful day, as we all know, some work is inevitable. Especially, I guess, if you care for sheep, right? Sheep falling into a pit. Now, this just reminds me, I think it was like a YouTube reel or something like that, where, the sheep was like stuck in this this break. I don't know, it was like earthquake or whatever, you know what I'm talking about? And it's just like separated, but it's like all the way down throughout the whole field. And the sheep was stuck, in this part, and the shepherd's taking forever to get this sheep out, right? Finally gets the sheep out, and the sheep, frolics, taking off, and then later jumps and right back into the crack, just further down. So then, sure enough, the shepherd's got to go get him out. I think the meme, or what was the caption on this, was something like this is like me and the Lord, right? This is like my relationship with Jesus. Like, he gets me out of it, but then I'm right back, where he started. So yes, what do you do if your sheep gets stuck, falls into a pit? Jesus says you lift them out. You go back then to resting. Then you consider this: how much more value is a man than a sheep? Like, you wouldn't leave a man in a pit. If you came along and you saw a man in a pit and be like, sorry, it's the Sabbath, I'd love to help you, but I can't. It's the Sabbath, and pulling you out of here would be way too much work. No, certainly not. You would help the man. So therefore, yes, it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Jesus next says to the man with the withered hand, stretch out your hand. And the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy, just like the other one. I love this for many reasons. I love this. One thing is just the irony of it. I mean, he's just talking about like doing no work on the Sabbath and not healing on the Sabbath. Jesus is standing there doing nothing. He merely tells the man to stretch out his hand. Jesus didn't touch him. Jesus didn't do any work. He just gave the command. The man's the one that did the work, and it was not really work. He just stretched out his hand, right? That's not breaking any Sabbath laws either. So perfectly not breaking any Sabbath laws, neither the one God said nor the ones that they have come up with on their own. He heals the man on the Sabbath without doing any work. I love it. Yet everybody knows that it was Jesus' doing. Also, if you remember, just the power here, the woman reaches out to touch the hem of his garment, but here the man just stretches out his hand toward Jesus. And even just in that was enough to completely restore his hand. You start to think, man, who is this Jesus? Is he simply a prophet of God? No, not a prophet only. This is the Lord of the Sabbath, the one who gave the original command to Moses on the mountaintop. This is God in the flesh. And speaking of Moses on the mountaintop, do you remember him before the burning bush? This stretching out of the hand should remind us of someone. Exodus 4, 6 and 7. This is when Moses was wanting confirmation from the Lord. As the Lord told him, you're going to go to Pharaoh, tell him, let my people go. And you're going to tell my people that, I am, Yahweh has sent you. We learned about that last time in youth group, remember? So he says, okay, I need some confirmation here. Like, I need to know, right, that you really are who that you say that you are. And the Lord said to him, put your hand inside your cloak. He put his hand inside his cloak. And when he took it out, behold, his hand was leprous like snow. Then God said, put your hand back inside your cloak. So he put his hand back inside his cloak. And then when he took it out again, behold, it was restored like the rest of his flesh. Remember that. Moses wanted confirmation that this was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God said, you want confirmation that I am who I am? Stretch out your hand. You want confirmation to know that Jesus is who he says that he is? Matthew 12:13, he said to them, to the man, stretch out your hand, and the man stretched it out, and it was restored, healthy just like the other. So how did the Pharisees, who say they know the law, who say they know Exodus, he said they know chapter 20 and chapter 34. You never read chapter 4? The stretching out of the hand? Does that remind you of anything or of anyone? How did the Pharisees respond to this? Were they convinced that Jesus, yes, indeed, was the greater David, the Messiah? Did they believe that Jesus, wow, he must be the greater temple, God incarnate, tabernacling among men? Did they believe that Jesus was the God of Moses, of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and that he was here to set his people free? No. This is how they responded in verse 14. The Pharisees went out and conspired against him, how to destroy him. Why? Because the Pharisees wanted to be the experts of the law. And Jesus just schooled them. The Pharisees also wanted to use the law to gain power and influence over the people. And Jesus rebuked them for loving rituals more than mercy, for loving their man-made Sabbath laws more than people. So if we think about how we could even bring some application points to us today, first and foremost is Jesus is not saying go ahead and break the law of God. Not a big deal, right? God's merciful. Go ahead and break God's law. That's not the moral of the story here. No, obey God's law. Why? Because we love God. Not because we want a greater standing before people, not because we want to try to lord it over people to say that we're better than others because of how well we obey God's word, but no, we obey God's word because we love him. Jesus said, if you love me, you'll obey my commands. And God's law is not burdensome, it's good. This is Psalm 119, as was read in the call to worship, verses 33 through 35, teach me, O Lord, the way of your statutes, and I will keep it to the end. Give me understanding that I may keep your law and observe it with my whole heart. With all that I am, with everything that I have, I want to obey you and please you and live my life for you. Lead me in the path of your commandments, for I delight in it. I delight in walking in your ways, because they're not just arbitrary rules. They teach me how to be like you, your character, your nature, to know how to be both righteous and yet merciful, and knowing when and how to balance all these things together. God is all-powerful. He's worthy of all glory, honor, and praise. But our God is not a tyrant. He loves mercy even over ritual. Now, the rabbinical teaching on the Sabbath had gotten way out of control. God's commandment not to work was very general, right? And they were so specific. They would write all these ridiculous things. They said a man could not lay with his wife on the Sabbath, could not ride on an animal, for the beast needs to rest, could not slaughter an animal or process them, could not start a fire. You'd have to start all these preparations on the Friday before the Saturday, the Sabbath, as to not do any work at all on the Saturday. You had to do all your work ahead of time. And if you didn't do your preparation, then you didn't eat. They viewed breaking the Sabbath as worthy of death. They would not put forth even the smallest amount of energy. There were limits on how much weight you could carry. There was a limit on how many steps you could take. One more ounce or one more step would be a violation of God's law and worthy of death. That's how all the community took obedience to the Sabbath. Again, they had made the Sabbath exhausting. Then Maccabees and Josephus, a Jewish historian, record multiple attacks by invading armies. Guess when they would attack the Jews? On the Sabbath day. And guess what? They wouldn't fight back. They wouldn't resist. Their men, women, and children were all killed. This happened twice. And then finally, one of their leaders, Mattathias, concludes that while they ought not plan an attack on their enemies on a Sabbath, that they were permitted to defend themselves should their enemy attack them on the Sabbath. Yeah. Standing by while your family is slaughtered is not honorable, it's not worshipful, it's unfaithful, it's not pious, it's pathetic. It is lawful, Jesus says, to do good on the Sabbath, to defend your family, to feed your family if they're hungry. Jesus is not a tyrant. If you must do something on the Sabbath that might even be considered work, some of you are like, I need to mow the grass later and the sun is out. Make sure it's worshipful to God. Make sure that it's good for your family, good for you, good for your neighbor. How much more valuable are their lives than the life of a sheep? The Jews were elevating their traditions, their rituals, their man-made laws that God never said as being equal to God's law. And when we do the same, we do not honor, we do not obey God, we elevate ourselves instead to be in his place. Oftentimes, and many of you have experienced these things, churches can create burdens on people that God did not ask for them to carry. And when we ourselves pass judgments, we need to make sure that we do not condemn the guiltless. We also need to make sure that while obedience to God's law is absolutely of utmost importance, Jesus says the greatest of all commands is to love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, with all of your mind, and with all of your strength. And the one like it, to love your neighbor as yourself, and that all of the laws and commands of God find their telos in those two commands. So we obey God's law because we love God with all of our heart, mind, soul, and strength. And it's not burdensome, it is our delight. And also we love people. We do good to them. We show mercy to them. We show patience with them. Yes, even to our spouse and to our children, right? We show patience, love, and kindness, obeying God's commands, desiring to walk in his ways, and desiring that others would walk in his ways as well. So whoever you meet this week, no matter where they're at in their walk with God, or maybe not walking with them at all, I pray that you would meet them and that your main goal for them would be for their good and for God's glory, that they would come to know him and to walk in his ways. Let us pray.